Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on Christmas Eve with my latest rant of the week. Now, it may seem a little incongruous to you that I'm ranting on the day before Christmas. After all, this is supposed to be the season of peace and cheer and goodwill amongst all men and women. Well, the way that I look at it, this rant will purge me of all the righteous indignation that has accumulated in me over the past few days. Once purged of that indignation, I'll be able to be more cheerful, peaceful, and full of goodwill. So why am I feeling so much righteous indignation today? Well, in the wake of the Bondi Beach massacre, yet another Western state has embarked upon yet another assault on free speech, and the Zionists are clamoring for even more repression of people of conscience. According to the BBC, the Australian government intends to ban the phrase globalize the Intifada as part of a crackdown on what it describes as hateful speech. And here I'm going to show you an article from the BBC published a few days ago, which reports that Chris Minns, the Premier of the Australian state of New South Wales, where the massacre occurred, confirmed he would seek to classify the chant globalize the Intifada as hate speech. Minns also suggested that he would tighten protest laws to scale back mass demonstrations and encourage what he described as a summer of calm. That sounds so nice, doesn't it? A summer of calm. But behind this soothing phrase lies the sinister goal of using the full force of the state to brutally suppress peaceful opposition to a damn genocide. So it doesn't stop there, my friends. The British government quickly got in on the act. This same report from the BBC disclosed that two pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested last week for allegedly shouting slogans involving Intifada at a demonstration in central London. What we are witnessing here is part of a clear pattern in the West. When the public's emotions are inflamed by a terrifying event, some Western government invariably exploits the public's fears and anger by imposing more restrictions on free speech and the right to protest. Then, when the restriction has become normalized in that country, it spreads like a cancer to other Western countries. Australia is fertile ground for launching new Western experiments in censorship because, unlike the United States, Canada, and some other Western states, Australia does not have a Bill of Rights. That also happens to be true, by the way, of the United Kingdom. It does not have a Bill of Rights, and as a result, the UK has been leading the charge in recent years in cracking down on the free speech rights of those who oppose the crimes of Western governments and their proxies. And perhaps the most notorious example of this is a section of the UK's Terrorism Act 2000, namely Section 12, which I have put up on the screen here. And I want to focus on the areas that I have sidebarred in orange, namely Clause 1A of Section 12, which is titled Support. That's what the section's titled. And 1A says a person commits an offense if the person expresses an opinion or belief that is supportive of a prescribed organization. So that is an organization that the British government has deemed to be a terrorist organization. The fact that it has come to that determination and made that designation without any due process at all, without satisfying any court that the targeted entity is in fact engaged in or promoting or facilitating terrorism, doesn't matter to the British government. It doesn't have to prove that the organization is in fact engaged in terrorism or threatening to carry out acts of terrorism. In its great mightiness and infinite wisdom, it can say this is a terrorist organization, and if you as a citizen dare to contest that and say anything which might be construed as support for that organization, you can go to jail. And if you look at the bottom of the screen here in the other section that I've sidebarred in orange, you'll see that you can go to jail for a very long time indeed, namely up to 14 years, basically for contesting some designation the government made with no due process whatsoever. Now, the Starmer regime has just invoked this Orwellian legislation as a basis for detaining none other than activist Greta Thunberg. Here you can see on the screen a report from Agence France-Presse, Associated Press, and Reuters that the UK police just arrested Greta Thunberg under the Terrorism Act because she had the audacity to be sitting quietly on the ground in a public place and bearing a sign which expressed support for the Palestine Action Organization, which, without any due process or justification whatsoever, the British government has designated as a terrorist organization. So you can see this is just one of countless examples in which this legislation has been used to suppress criticism of Israel's UK-backed genocide. Now, if Australia gets away with criminalizing the word intifada, I guarantee you that other Western states will follow Australia's lead, and the UK will almost certainly be right behind the Aussies. In fact, here in Canada, despite the existence of a Bill of Rights, namely the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which has constitutional status, Canadian Zionists in the corporate media are already howling in indignation for the authorities to criminalize that term, intifada. And before I tell you what the Canadian Zionist hysteria over the word intifada is all about, let me remind you what the word means. And it is, as many of you will know, an Arabic term. So who better than an Arab journalist and one of high esteem to tell us what the term intifada actually means? And our good friend Ali Abunimah of Electronic Intifada, given the name of his news platform, which he founded years ago, which has hundreds of thousands of followers, he should know better than anybody what the damn word means. So here's what Ali had to say a few days ago.
Asa, we often get, people say, Zionist critics, oh, the electronic intifada, they have violence in their name. There's nothing violent about the word intifada. It's an assertion of popular mobilization, of people struggling together to achieve their rights. Those who are violent are the ones who during the first intifada of the late 1980s brutally murdered Palestinians, children, kids, young people going out to demonstrate. Those who, what intifada means for Palestinians is how Palestinians across the West Bank and Gaza in the late 80s and early 90s organized schools and universities and kindergartens in their homes clandestinely because Israel shut down all schooling at every level for 3 years during the Intifada. So that's what an Intifada is. You could say that the civil rights movement in the U.S. was an Intifada.
Mm-hmm.
You could
the
say
Warsaw
that
Ghetto Uprising was an Intifada.
Yeah, I mean, that became...
You heard it, folks. Even the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising could quite fairly be described as an intifada. Are the Zionists upset about that? Now, let me tell you about this latest round of outright hysteria in Zionist circles in Canada over this term. And as I'm about to show you, I myself am one of the anti-genocide journalists being targeted by this hysteria. The lunacy appears to have started with an editorial in the Globe and Mail, Canada's paper of record. And you can see here a post on X issued on the 17th of December. This all got the ball rolling, promoting an editorial at the Globe and Mail, reputed to be Canada's paper of record, which is essentially saying that the phrase globalize the Intifada is responsible for the carnage in Bondi Beach. Yes, that's what these so-called journalists argued on the pages of Canada's paper of record. Now, the person who put this post out is one of the more, I dare say, respected journalists of the Globe and Mail, and I use the term journalist loosely, a character by the name of Stephen Chase. This is a mouthpiece, this person, Stephen Chase, for the war machine. And if you don't believe me, check this out. Very recently, Chase, along with his compadre at the Globe and Mail, Robert Fife, basically considered to be the dean of geopolitical reporting in Canada's corporate media, they accepted a journalism award from the Canadian Defense Associates organization, which is essentially a lobby organization for military contractors, and one which is heavily influenced by the Canadian Department of War, or as it calls itself, the Department of Defense. And I ask you folks, what self-respecting journalist would accept a journalism award from the lobby organization, the most powerful lobby organization in Canada for the war machine? Well, Stephen Chase and Robert Fife would, and that tells you all you need to know about these two characters who are promoting this absurd notion that the phrase globalize the Intifada is somehow responsible for the atrocity committed on the shores of Australia a couple of weeks ago. Now, the Globe editorial and Stephen Chase's post about it, promoting it, elicited a perfectly reasonable response from a Canadian podcaster by the name of Rachel Gilmore. And Gilmore has, to her credit, repeatedly condemned Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people during these past 2+ years of Israeli horror. And here you can see what Rachel had to say. And I'll quote it. I think it bears reading in detail. It's a perfect example for someone who wants to vilify a movement by playing on readers' racist assumptions. When it comes to the phrase globalize the Intifada, which means globalize the resistance, the intent of the speaker's form of resistance matters, which is why it can be deployed as a bad faith example by critics adding assumptions of violence that aren't inherent in its use. In other words, attributing to the users of the phrase violent intentions, which they themselves do not have. And she goes on, Rachel, and says, if they know readers will be more likely to assume violence from the group they're trying to vilify with the example, it's even more effective. So gross. Yes, it is indeed gross. Now, Gilmore's measured comment provoked a strong reaction from one of the most shameless genocide apologists in the Canadian media, person by the name of Robin Urbach. And here you can see Urbach's profile. She too is a so-called journalist at the Globe and Mail, which published this editorial claiming that globalize the Intifada is somehow responsible for the carnage in Australia. And I would not at all be surprised, although the editorial, as I understand, is unsigned, that Urbach herself drafted the damn thing, or at least had a significant role in its drafting. Urbach, who is Jewish, disclosed in 2014 that she had gone to Israel on a birthright tour with the goal of becoming one of the apartheid regime's intellectual ambassadors in the West. Ever since then, Urbach has used her platform at the Globe and Mail to lie shamelessly about Israel's genocide in Palestine and about Israel's critics. So what Urbach does here, and I'm going to show you her response to Rachel Gilmore's tweet, is basically to poo-poo the idea that the intentions of the person who uses the phrase matter. And Urbach writes, if intention matters for globalize the Intifada, as Rachel says, does it matter for other speech or behavior? If someone wears blackface for Halloween, but they didn't intend to offend, is it still wrong? If someone innocently but ignorantly asks an Asian Canadian where they are really from, should we expect them to accept it? So what Urbach, really is doing here again, and I want to drill down into this somewhat because it's a very commonly deployed argument, one that Zionists turn against us all the time, those of us who defend the Palestinian cause. What matters is not, Urbach is arguing, what you, the speaker, intended, but rather what matters is how the recipient of the message received it and was affected by it. This is what Zionists constantly do. They place the emphasis on how they claim to feel when they hear certain pro-Palestine phrases, and they discount altogether, or at least diminish the importance of what the speaker, the user of the phrase, actually intended. They want policymakers, Zionists, to embrace the notion that if Zionists say they feel threatened by certain forms of speech, then we should ban and even criminalize those forms of speech, regardless of what the speaker intended. Of course, were we to accept their approach to speech, which Zionists allege to be hateful, there would soon be no condemnation of Israel that one could utter without risking imprisonment, because by all indications, people like Robin Urbach are threatened and made to feel unsafe and offended by any serious criticism of Israel's genocidal regime. Now, let's just pause here to apply Urbach's logic to the words commonly used by Israel and its defenders. And I want to focus in particular on something that we are told ad nauseum by Zionist defenders of Israel. We are told constantly, on countless occasions, not just by the defenders of Israel, but by Israeli government officials, that their genocide of the Palestinian people, of course, they don't call it that, they deny that it's genocide, but it is a genocide, that their mass murder of Palestinian children is simply Israel exercising its right of self-defense. We have heard this on countless occasions, and we have heard it so often in connection with Israel's satanic crimes that it is now quite commonplace amongst those of us on the side of the victims of this genocide to interpret the phrase, Israel is defending itself and Israel is exercising its right to defend itself, as an intention to mass murder Palestinian civilians. This is not only a fact that people interpret it in that way, but it is in fact a reasonable interpretation of the phrase Israel has a right to defend itself, because it is so closely associated in people's minds with Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. It has been invoked over and over and over again to justify those crimes. So if we apply Robin Urbach's reasoning to the Zionists' use and Israel's use of the phrase, Israel has a right to defend itself, well, we should be criminalizing it. We should be categorizing it as hate speech, and we should be tossing into jail anyone who says that Israel has the right to defend itself when Israel is in fact carrying out a genocide. Because after all, their intentions don't matter. If they didn't intend that that phrase was going to incite or justify Israel's violence against innocent Palestinian civilians, policymakers shouldn't care about that. Courts should attach no importance to that. What matters is that those of us, the millions of us in this country, who care about the victims of Israel's atrocities, interpret it in that way, and we do so based upon a mountain of experience with Zionist propaganda. Now, can you just imagine what Robin Urbach would say if she were presented with this argument, if she were told, or if it were argued to her, that a Zionist saying Israel has a right to defend itself in the context of Israel's genocide and other atrocities against Palestinians constitute hate speech, and that people who use that phrase in order to justify Israel's conduct should be tossed into the hoosgow? Can you imagine how she'd react? Her head would explode, man. She would be apoplectic. And the reason that she would be apoplectic is that Palestinian lives mean nothing to Robin Urbach. How Palestinians and their supporters are made to feel by the propagandistic rhetoric of Zionists and the Israeli government is insignificant to her, because she views Palestinians and their supporters as being no better than insects. Anyways, as this debate about globalize to Intifada raged on X, Canadian journalist Nora Loretto decided to weigh in. I know Nora personally. She's an excellent journalist, a highly principled individual, and an outspoken defender of Palestinian human rights. And this is what Nora had to say on December 18th on X. She said, anyways, let's globalize the Intifada at the Globe and Mail first. Terry Newman of the National Post again, another prominent Zionist hack in the Canadian corporate media, promptly went berserk upon seeing this post. She suggested that Nora had threatened the people who work at the Globe and Mail. And here you see it, folks. Is it just me, or does this sound like a threat? Newman pontificated. And it gets worse from there. But before I tell you what happened next, I do need to say a few words about the National Post. The National Post was founded decades ago by a character named Conrad Black, one of the most pompous and aggressive and foul-mouthed, offensive defenders of neoconservatism in Canadian political history. He ended up being tossed in jail in the United States in connection with allegations of security fraud. He now, occasionally appears on the pages of the National Post, but he has receded into the background because the National Post, years ago, after it ran into financial difficulty, as it has on numerous occasions, was effectively taken over by a hedge fund based in the United States called Chatham Asset Management, which aggressively promotes Donald Trump and has been doing so for years. This should be a matter of the utmost concern to Canadian policymakers, and particularly the anti-competition or the anti-monopoly regulators in Canada, because Post Media, the owner of the National Post, that is in fact the corporation that Chatham Asset Management now effectively controls. It's not just the National Post. Post Media is what it controls, and Post Media is the largest newspaper publisher in Canada. And I've had a lot to say about Post Media over the years. I've basically been at war with Post Media. Their newspapers have done numerous hit jobs on me, the most recent one being a front page article on the National Post published in mid-2024 while I was in Crimea as a journalist, trying to understand what was happening in the Ukraine war from the perspective of Russians and those Ukrainian citizens or former Ukrainian citizens who were living in areas controlled by the Russian military. And for the egregious sin of trying to understand their perspective, a fellow by the name of Adam Zivo, a columnist from the National Post, called me up while I was in Crimea and asked me for an interview. And I said I would do the interview, but only if I were enabled to record the entire thing, at which point I would publish it, because I didn't trust the National Post to faithfully report my answers to Zivo's biased questions. So he agreed that I could record it and publish the recording. I didn't, by the way, need to ask his permission under Canadian law. All you need is the consent of one person to record a conversation. But I did that anyways because I thought it was journalistically the professional thing to do. And Zivo then proceeded to interview me as I anticipated. He wrote a hit piece. They put it, big article accusing me of going to Crimea to whitewash Putin's war and of being a Kremlin propagandist and all the rest of the usual smears. And then a few months ago, after Zivo's piece was published by the National Post, Zivo revealed, with no shame whatsoever, that at the time that he interviewed me, he was working with Canadian and Ukrainian intelligence. That's right, folks. He was actually working with Canadian Ukrainian intelligence. And let me be clear, I've never worked with any intelligence agency. I've never given any information to any intelligence agency. I've never obtained information from an intelligence agency. I've never sought or obtained or been offered any compensation by any intelligence agency. But this clown actually was working with Canadian Ukrainian intelligence at the time he interviewed me and wrote that hit piece. And when I complained to the National Post editors about this, not only did they refuse to take down Zivo's piece, but they didn't even put a notice anywhere in the article that Zivo had been working with Canadian Ukrainian intelligence at the time that he interviewed me. To this very day, the readers of the National Post, they can see the article. It's still up on the website, but they have not been put on notice about this highly relevant fact. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about the National Post. When it comes to Israel, the National Post, I tell you, man, in years of following their coverage of Israel, and the only reason why I follow it is because they have a large audience and they do have significant impact on Canadian public opinion. I have not seen a single occasion on which they have written a peep of criticism of this genocidal mass murdering regime. So anyways, that is the background of the employer of Terry Newman. And here you can see Newman's profile on X, where she identifies herself not only as a columnist for the National Post, but also as a senior editor, which probably means that she played an important role in a dastardly editorial, which the National Post published on December 22nd on the question of whether globalize the Intifada is hate speech. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So what happened next after Newman suggested that Nora Loreto had threatened people at the Globe and Mail? Well, author and activist Eve Engler, a frequent guest on our program, who is well known for his defense of the Palestinian cause, decided to enter the fray. And here's how Eve responded to Newman's insinuation that Nora Loreto had threatened the staff of the Globe and Mail. You'll see that he replied to Newman's post about Nora Loreto by proclaiming, "Let's globalize the Intifada" at the National Post. And at that point, my friends, all hell broke loose. Tristan Hopper, another so-called journalist at the National Compost, then referred to Nora and Eve as scum and demanded that they be jailed. And here you can see that Hopper actually provided the threats line phone number for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is Canada's version, I suppose, of the CIA, and also threw in to his X post the phone number for the National Security Branch of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is basically Canada's FBI. And then he added, rather uncharitably, that Nora and Eve are scum. They want us dead. They should be in jail. Call now. Tristan, there ain't nobody who constitutes worse scum in the Canadian media than the likes of you. Now, the Zionist feeding frenzy on X did not stop there. Soon, we heard from another notorious defender of Israel's genocidal regime, a character by the name of Brian Passafume. And you can see here that he said, when the far-left zealots abandon clever innuendo for straight-up threats, you know we're in trouble. Where was the straight-up threat? Did Nora say anything about killing people, wounding people, taking up arms against people? Was there any call for any violent act? No, she used the word intifada, which is any informed, objective observer would know, in Arabic simply means uprising. And again, any informed, objective observer, anybody with an ounce of common sense would know that it is possible to rise up against oppression and lies that justify that oppression without resorting to violence. There are, yes, Brian Passafume, peaceful methods of resistance and uprising. Now, Passafume happens to be a reporter at another rag owned by the post-media newspaper empire, namely the Toronto Sun, which regrettably has one of the largest readerships in Canada. And man, if there's any major media outlet in this country that is even more fanatical in its support of Israel and its hatred of Israel's critics, it would clearly be the Toronto Sun. Now, at some point over the past few days, Nora decided to delete her post about globalizing the Intifada at the Globe and Mail. Now, the reason why she did that, I actually took a few minutes to chat with Nora about this just to make sure I understood why she had deleted it. Nora, as she went on to explain on X, was inundated with calls to violence herself, explicit, overt calls to violence and threats as a result of all the claims, the false and malicious claims that were being made about her post, her call to globalize the Intifada at the Globe and Mail. And she decided that all of this, this pressure, all of this vilification, all of these threats, she does have a family. I'm sure she was very much concerned about her family. it just wasn't worth it for her to leave that post up. And that's why she took it down. So that did not regrettably calm the Zio lunatics. Jonathan Kay, one of the loudest and crudest genocide apologists in Canada's corporate media, also decided to hurl insults at Nora and Eve. And this is just one of the ways in which he did that. He issued multiple posts about this controversy. And what he wrote in this particular one was, update, communism, terrorism enthusiast and former journalist Nolor has deleted her comment calling for violence against the Globe and Mail. That's a lie. And she ain't a terrorism supporter. You are, Kay. And he goes on, Kay, to say, but communism, terrorism enthusiast and failed NDP leadership candidate Angler Eve is sticking with his call for violence against the National Post. That too is a flagrant, shameless lie. But we've come to expect as much from the eminent Mr. Kay. Then, as if that weren't bad enough, Newman from the National Post decided to double down on her insinuation that Nora had called for violence against the Globe and Mail. And here she is disclosing proudly that on December 20th, she filed a report about Eve Engler with the Montreal police and then asked, what's going on, officers? And you can see that she's quoted in her post revealing her complaint to the Montreal police, a post by a character named Mayor Weinstein, who now runs an organization called Israel Now. And Mayor Weinstein is the founder and was for many years the director of the Canadian branch of the Jewish Defense League, which the FBI designated many years ago as a terrorist organization. That's who Mayor Weinstein is. And he now, because his organization was so discredited in North America, he came up with some other gig, changed the name, called it Israel Now. And Eve took it upon himself to say, globalize the Intifada at Israel Now. Good on you, Eve. And so, of course, Mayor Weinstein, this bloodthirsty Palestinian genocidal racist, or anti-Palestinian genocidal racist, I should say, took it upon himself to accuse Eve of calling for violence against supporters of Israel Now and himself. Of course, this is a blatant lie. Globalize the Intifada, as I'm going to explain in some more detail shortly, is not by any means a call for violence. Now, at some point in this feeding frenzy, one of the least reputable people in all of Canadian media, Sue-Ann Levy, decided to chime in as well and to come after me personally. Here is Levy saying on X that I am a greasy man whose hatred towards the Jewish people is obsessive. He has nothing else in life. You know, when I was a kid growing up in Canada, I came to Canada. My parents came to Canada in the 1950s. And at the time when I was born and raised in this country, Canada was not a particularly welcoming place for people from Southern Europe, people like Greeks, Portuguese, Italians. We were regarded by many in the wider elements of Canadian society as being second-class citizens. In fact, the reason why my parents and so many others from Southern Europe were brought to Canada by the Canadian government in the 50s and the 60s was because they needed cheap labor. You know, the more affluent segments of Canadian society didn't want to do the dirty work. And the Canadian government didn't want to go to the global south. God forbid that they should be promoting, you know, immigration to Canada by black and brown people. So they went to the south of Europe, and they first, you know, went to that well until, you know, the living conditions in Southern Europe were sufficiently prosperous that the people there didn't want to come to North America and do the dirty work any longer. And that's when they then started to go to the global south and to import people to do the menial labor that the more affluent segments of Canadian society didn't want to do. So in any case, that's a whole other story. The point here is that when I was growing up, I was repeatedly, as were my three sisters, subjected to bigoted smears by white kids at the public school we attended, Sir John A. Macdonald Public School. And one of the things that I was frequently called when I was being bullied was a greaser, a greasy greaser. Now, that all stopped around the time that I graduated from Sir John A. Macdonald Public School and went off to high school. And for decades, I had not heard that smear until Sue-Ann Livy began to deploy it against me again. Actually, last year, she's been routinely referring to me as a greaser and a greasy man on social media. This racist, by the way, was one of the most aggressively hyped reporters at the Toronto Sun, the same newspaper where Brian Passafume works. And then in circumstances that are a bit murky, she no longer was working for the Toronto Sun. I think what happened, I'm guessing here, is that Sue-Ann Levy became too racist, too bigoted, even for the Toronto Sun. And so she made some bullshit claim that she was going off to become an actress, and apparently that's gone absolutely nowhere. Not at all surprising for this talentless person whose singular objective in life is to lie about Israel's sadistic crimes. In any case, this is the kind of depth to which the Zionists and the Canadian media have sunk during the course of this genocide. Now, predictably, after all of this, Liberal Member of Parliament Anthony Housefather decided to pile on. And here you can see a tweet from Anthony Housefather on December 19th, shortly after this brouhaha erupted, in which he writes that globalize the Intifada is not an innocent chant or statement. Whether directed at Jewish Canadians or newsrooms, it is understood by recipients as a call for violence against them. Which recipients? Do the opinions of people who are not supporters of Israel matter, Mr. Housefather? What if the people receiving these statements support the Palestinian cause and don't find them at all problematic? Don't their feelings matter? Don't their opinions matter? So he's obviously telling us here, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, that the only feelings that matter are the ones experienced by Zionists when they hear this phrase. Everybody else, whether they constitute a majority of the population or not, doesn't mean anything. Their opinions don't count at all. And he goes on and says, there are lots of words out there. Nobody needs to use these unless they intend to cause fear. Well, we don't have to have a compelling reason to use these words, Mr. Housefather. This is what free speech is all about. We have the option of using words which, for whatever reason, best express what we intend to say. Now, Intifada, as I explained at the outset, and as Mr. Housefather should know, is an Arabic term. It comes from the language of the victims of Israel's genocide and has a very particular meaning, and it has historical significance for them. It has almost a sacred status, I would say, amongst defenders of the Palestinian cause in the Arabic world. In fact, it has a very elevated status, the concept of Intifada, amongst all Arabs who oppose oppression and persecution. So because we live in a society which values free speech, a supposedly democratic society, we don't have to justify our use of this word. We use it because for the various historical and cultural reasons that I've just indicated. And if you, as a Zionist, decide that this is somehow a threat, even though you have no basis for believing that that is what we intend by our use of this term, that's your problem. That's just your problem. But again, we see here how this arch-Zionist, and by the way, Anthony Housefather, he is the chair of the Canada-Israel Parliamentary Group. Here he is, again, placing primacy on the feelings of Zionists rather than on the intentions of those who defend the victims of Zionism. And just to let you know how lunatic this man is in his support of Israel, during the course of the past 2+ years of genocide, Housefather publicly mused about leaving the Liberal Party and crossing over to the Conservatives because, in his opinion, the Liberal Party had not been sufficiently pro-Israel. This would be the same Liberal Party that continues to accord trade benefits to Israel. The Liberal government, throughout this genocide, has refused to sanction any of the military leaders of Israel, has not placed any sanctions on Netanyahu or Gallant, even though they have been indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the ICC, allows Canadians to serve in the Israeli military, even serve in Gaza as Israel carries out a genocide, allows Canadian organizations to have charitable status as they raise money and funnel money to the genocidal entity and to organizations in Israel that are associated with Israel's military. That's what the Liberal government has done. And this nutbar, Anthony Housefather, believed, or at least posited throughout the genocide at various points, that his government was not being sufficiently supportive towards Israel and that it didn't improve its servitude to the genocidal project that he was going to cross over to the primary opposition of the Liberal Party, the Conservatives. Now, I decided to become involved in this brouhaha when Zionist podcaster Jesse Brown attacked Nora for her tweet. And here's what Brown had to say. He said that the tweet was vile, reckless, and stupid. And you can see there he had quoted Nora's tweet calling for the globalization of the Intifada at the Globe and Mail, but she had deleted it by that point in time or subsequently. And then I chimed in by saying globalize the Intifada at Canada Land. Well, what is Canada Land? Canada Land is a podcast that Jesse Brown founded several years ago. And before I tell you about that podcast, let's move on then and see how Jesse responded to what I had to say about Canada Land. He accused me at that point of being a Twitter thug. And Brown didn't stop there. Around the same time that Brown referred to me as a Twitter thug, Terry Newman, the senior editor from the National Post, came back into the conversation, again characterized what I had said as a threat to Canada Land. Now, Jesse Brown continued by issuing a thread about, as he put it, lines being crossed. And here is the thread which he published on X on December 19th. He wrote, today another line was crossed in Canadian discourse, which he puts in quotation marks, this time targeting the press. And then he says, Nora Loretto said, then deleted, let's globalize the Intifada at the Globe and Mail. Rejected NDP leadership candidate Engler Eve said, globalize the Intifada at the National Post. Activist lawyer Dimitri Lascaris said, globalize the Intifada at Canada Land. And he writes, the game we are supposed to play here is we say, you're inciting violence against news organizations. And they say, whatever do you mean? We meant only that we need an uprising, a shaking off in these newsrooms. But this has been a really fucked up Hanukkah, and I have no patience for games. It started with the Bondi Beach massacre. Today we learned that 3 guys have been hunting for Jewish women to rape and kill in Toronto. To some people, Intifada means killing Jews. Well, again, if you insist upon feeling that that's what it means, why should my speech be curtailed because you impose some unreasonable, extraordinarily biased Zionist interpretation on my language? I shouldn't be restrained from using this terminology in defense of the victims of the genocide being perpetrated by the state that you, Jesse Brown, fanatically support, just because you claim that it makes you feel threatened. And I'm going to lay out for you in some detail in just a moment why Jesse Brown and all these others, lovers of Israel's sadistic entity, shouldn't feel threatened by this kind of language when people like me or Eve Engler or Nora Loretto, who have absolutely no history of violence, never been charged with physical violence, never been convicted of committing an act of physical violence. We've never come out and said, perpetrate an act of violence, attack these people, assault these people. There's absolutely no reason why a rational, objective observer would interpret our language in that way. And if you choose to do that, that's your business, Jesse Brown. I'm not going to become the prisoner of your prejudices. Neither should my colleagues in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. Now, let me pause here to say a few more words about this character, Jesse Brown. I first became aware of Jesse Brown back in 2016 when I was the justice critic in the shadow cabinet of the Green Party. I brought forward with the help of comrades in the party, I led the initiative a resolution for the party to adopt, officially supporting the use of BDS to put an end to Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights. Over the objections of the leader of the party, Elizabeth May, the strenuous objections, the party members adopted the resolution. And around that time, Jesse Brown did a podcast in which, in a really sneaky, sort of slimy way, he cast aspersions on me and the other people who supported this resolution, and did so without naming us. And after that, Jesse Brown kind of receded from the main discourse in the country around Israel and Palestine, was not a particularly vocal person in the context of that debate. But when the genocide began in October 2023, Jesse Brown's Zionist instincts went into overdrive. And let me tell you just how supportive and aggressive this man has been in supporting the genocidal regime throughout these past 2+ years of horror. His podcast, by the way, Canada Land, the ostensible purpose of it is to criticize the Canadian media. And certainly Brown has offered criticism over the years of the Canadian media, some of it justified. But when it comes to Israel, he has flushed his capacity for critical thinking right down the toilet. To help you understand just how extreme he is in his support for Israel, I reviewed Brown's posts on X over the past few months, and I examined the period of August 1st to December 21st. There's no magic in that period. I just didn't have time to go back and look further. So I picked a few months to try to get a sense of what he's been saying during this period. And during that period, I counted 155 posts by Brown on X, and no fewer than 142 of his posts related to alleged anti-Semitism. That's 92% of his posts. And if you're suspecting that a lot of those allegations of anti-Semitism were directed at people who oppose Israel's genocide and are protesting against it, you would be entirely correct. In addition, during that period, Brown did not post a single time, not once, about racism against any other racialized group, such as Indigenous persons, Blacks, or Arabs, nor did he say anything, not one peep, in all of that commentary about anti-Muslim bigotry. It's as if the only form of bigotry that matters to Jesse Brown is anti-Jewish bigotry. In addition, from August 1st to December 21st, Brown made 23 posts that mentioned Israel, Palestine, or Zionism, and not one of them criticized Israel or Zionism even meekly. Now, bear in mind that throughout that period, Israel was committing the crime of crimes against the Palestinian people, mass murdering Palestinian children, starving them to death, burning them alive, shooting them in the head, and doing so with audacity. And yet, Jesse Brown, in all of that abundant Twitter commentary about the Jewish people, about Zionism, about Israel, could not utter one word of criticism of the Israeli regime. Now, as if all of this was not enough hysteria over the phrase globalize the Intifada, the National Post decided to publish a long editorial about this controversy on December 22nd. As you can see, the editorial was published, Globalizing the Intifada Means War on Canada. And I want to highlight for you the second paragraph. It may be a bit too small to read for you, so I'm going to read it. While the word intifada means uprising in Arabic, anyone using the term, particularly in the context of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is very likely referring to the second intifada between 2000 and 2004 in Israel. By the way, it didn't happen primarily in Israel. It happened primarily in the occupied territories, which aren't part of Israel. But let's put that aside. The National Post editors go on and say, following the breakdown of yet another peace process, 1,053 Israelis, 70% of whom were civilians, were killed, largely by Palestinian terrorists attacking public places like markets and buses In all, there were 130 suicide bombings. The purpose was to target civilians in civilian areas. Well, since the National Post raised the subject of civilian casualties, I thought I would share with you a fuller picture of what happened during the Second Intifada. Now, you can see here, this is a report from Wikipedia citing reputable sources like the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem and the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. And what is stated here is that the sources do not vary widely over the data on Israeli casualties. B'Tselem reports that 1,053 Israelis were killed by Palestinian attacks through April 2008. Israeli journalist Zev Schiff reported similar numbers, citing the Shin Bet as his source. And then further on it says, this is the second paragraph from the bottom, there is little dispute as to the total number of Palestinians killed by Israelis. B'Tselem, again an Israeli human rights organization, reports that through 30 April 2008, there were 4,745 Palestinians killed by Israeli security forces and 44 Palestinians killed by Israeli civilians. B'Tselem also reports 577 Palestinians killed by Palestinians. So the number of Palestinians killed in the Second Intifada by Israeli security forces and Israeli civilians was nearly 5 times as great as the number of Israelis who were killed during the Second Intifada. But it gets worse than this. The last paragraph here states, between September 2000 and January 25, 69% of Israeli fatalities were male, while over 95% of the Palestinian fatalities were male. Remember these children, reports that as of 1 February 2008, 119 Israeli children aged 17 and under had been killed by Palestinians. Over the same time period, 982 Palestinian children aged 17 and under were killed by Israelis. That is approximately 9 times as many Palestinian children killed as Israeli children killed during the Second Intifada. Of course, none of this is mentioned. The fact that Palestinians suffered far more casualties during the Second Intifada than Israelis is nowhere on the radar of the National Post in its editorial of December 22nd, because like Robin Urbach, like Jesse Brown, like Tristan Hopper, like Stephen Chase, and all of these Zio lunatics in the Canadian media, Palestinian lives are not worth the lives of insects. That's why this appears nowhere in the National Post editorial. Now, quite apart from the fact that Israelis killed far more Palestinians in the Second Intifada, the National Post in its editorial cites zero evidence to support its claim that when Palestinians or their supporters use the word Intifada, it's quote unquote very likely they're referring to the Second Intifada. They could just as well be referring to the First Intifada, which was overwhelmingly nonviolent. Or they might not be referring to any particular Intifada. They just might be using the word Intifada in a generic sense. What we're seeing here again is the tactic commonly employed by Zionist smear artists. Whenever we defenders of the Palestinian cause employ a term or a slogan that is subject to interpretation, that has some symbolism, that is ambiguous to some degree, Zionists will invariably impose on that term the most sinister interpretation that their twisted minds can conjure up. Only the most sinister interpretation is ever entertained by them. And if you, as the person who actually employs the word or the slogan, contest that you had that intention, that is what you wanted to convey by using the slogan or the term, then they simply dismiss you as a liar. They say, no, you're not telling the truth. We know better than you do what you intended by those words. Zionists seem to think that they have some kind of otherworldly capacity to enter our minds and our hearts and discern better than we can what we intend by our own language. You know, the arrogance of these people knows no bounds. The last thing that I want to say about this so-called editorial published by the National Post on December 22nd is that it left out a critically vitally important piece of information. The National Post editors in this piece of garbage basically argued that globalize the Intifada is a call for violence against Zionists, and particularly Jewish persons, and that it therefore should be treated as hate speech, and people who use it should be subjected to criminal prosecution and imprisonment. That was the essential argument. So they were, in effect, expressing a view on a legal issue. Well, nowhere in their article did they mention the fact, the inconvenient fact, that just a few weeks ago, a Canadian court rendered a decision which essentially undermines their position. And I'm going to put up on the screen here an excerpt from that decision. The context here is that a few weeks ago, Toronto City Hall, after Canada belatedly, months ago, recognized the state of Palestine, Toronto City Hall accepted a request from supporters of the Palestinian cause to raise the Palestinian flag in front of City Hall. And when that happened, an extreme organization from the Zionist community, if I can call it that, filed an application for a preliminary injunction with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. And they made all sorts of claims about how this Palestinian flag and the language being employed by people who were going to be out there that day and who had advocated for the raising the Palestinian flag was threatening to them. And the judge dismissed, I think quite easily, their request for the preliminary injunction. And the Palestinian flag, as we reported live on Reason to Resist on that day, was actually raised. And in the course of dismissing this ludicrous application that they filed with the court, this is what the judge had to say. And I'm quoting, "There was considerable debate in the record about the use of certain slogans such as 'From the river to the sea, glory to the martyrs,' and the word Intifada. A number of interveners asked me to find those phrases to be anti-Semitic." Just pausing there, of course, these interveners were all loudmouth Zionist groups. And the judge then writes, "I accept that these expressions are perceived as hurtful and threatening to many Jews." He accepts that. But he says, however, there appears to be considerable variation, nuance, and context around the meaning of these terms, which in my mind would make it improper to automatically assume that they are anti-Semitic, especially on an interlocutory motion. So the judge is in effect saying here that there are legitimate interpretations of these words that are not anti-Semitic and that are not calls for violence against Jewish persons. And he's also saying that intentions do matter, the intentions of the speaker, and that he rejects the notion that the only thing that should matter in assessing the character of this language should be the feelings of those members of the Jewish community who support Israel. He just rejected that. So this decision, rendered only weeks before the National Post editorial of December 22nd, is mentioned nowhere in that decision. And these people claim to be journalists. Now, here's the reality. There are many nonviolent ways to rise up against propagandistic media organizations, and I'm going to give you just 3 examples. First of all, boycott them. Do not like, do not share their articles, do not subscribe to their media outlets, and do not donate money, do not purchase their content. Furthermore, encourage others not to like or share the material or to subscribe to their platforms or to donate to these organizations or purchase their content. That is what we classically describe and have for a very long time as a boycott. Here's another nonviolent way to engage in intifada against propagandistic media organizations. You can protest peacefully outside their offices, and you can name and shame their editors and their so-called journalists when they dare to show their faces in public. Call them out, denounce them for their support for genocide, disrupt peacefully their speeches. That too is a nonviolent form of intifada. And yet another way that you can engage nonviolently in intifada, an uprising against these disgraceful media organizations, is to write articles or compile videos or post commentary in social media exposing their lies and their hypocrisy. And just as I'm, in fact, doing now. And in fact, my friends, you can fairly regard this report, which you are watching presently, as a form of intifada. Let me be crystal clear. When I call to globalize the intifada at Zionist media outlets, I am not encouraging anyone to engage in violence against them. What I am encouraging people to do is to employ the forms of nonviolent resistance that I just described, or any other forms of nonviolent resistance that they, using their creative capacities, may be able to imagine and to implement. So yeah, boycott the Globe and Mail, boycott the National Post, boycott Canada Land. Do so, please, precisely in the manner that I have suggested. Protest peacefully at their offices. When their editors and fake journalists show their faces in public, call them out for their lies and for their hypocrisy. Don't share or like their material. Don't give them money. Don't subscribe to their platforms, and encourage other people to do likewise. At the end of the day, all of this is supremely ironic, because in effect, we, the persons who use the phrase globalize the intifada, are being accused of promoting or supporting terrorism, even inciting terrorism. But the reality is that the worst supporters of terrorism in the world today are those who accuse us, the Zionists. Because after all, what could be worse than mass murdering tens of thousands of children in the course of a 2-year genocidal rampage? Not to mention the tens of thousands of other civilians, women, elderly, military-aged men who are not engaged in any form of hostility, armed resistance against Israel's occupying regime. What could be worse terrorism than that? If you support that, you have forfeited the moral authority and the credibility to accuse anybody else of inciting violence and promoting terrorism. And in closing, my friends, I say to you with the greatest of respect that the best way to protect your right to free speech is to exercise your right to free speech. And in that vein, let me say and wish to you all a Merry Intifada Christmas. This is Dimitri Lascaris signing off from Montreal, Canada on December 24th, 2025.